Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Caitlin Carroll. I'm here on the faculty at the University of Minnesota over at the School of Public Health. Really excited to chair this session. Thanks for being here with us in the final session of the day. So I will introduce our presenters and then I'll turn it over so we can hear about these great papers. We have a slight change in order. Our first presenter will be Max Fineman, who's a PhD student in sociology and social policy at Princeton and an incoming postdoc at the NYU Wagner School of Public Service. Their research uses linked administrative data to study the interrelationships between housing markets and economic inequality. Then we'll have Luca Perdoni, who's an assistant professor in economics at the IFO Institute and LMU Munich. His research uses full count US Census data to study how government interventions can contribute to urban inequality. The paper he's presenting today, jointly with Hector Blanco, is part of this broader research agenda. It examines how New Deal public housing shaped racial segregation in US cities. Then we have Dustin Frye, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research combines urban economics and economic history, examining how public policy, infrastructure, and institutions shape the economic development, health, and long-run regional outcomes. Then we have Shiyan Wang, who's a PhD candidate in agricultural and resource economics at Colorado State University. His research focuses on household food insecurity, time use, and household decision-making. His presentation uses linked CPS food security supplement and American time use survey data. Then last but not least, we have Gabriel Cruz, who's a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Maryland College Park. His research is in labor and applied economics with interests at the intersection of education, health, gender, and demography. So with that, I'll turn it over to Max.
So hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Max Fineman. I'm an incoming postdoc at NYU Wagner, and I study relationships between housing markets and inequality. Today, I'm going to show you the first causal evidence on how rent control affects children who grow up under it, which I study by linking hand-digitized data set on rent control to decades of federal administrative microdata. In this project, it uses restricted use data from the Census Bureau. It's been reviewed for disclosure avoidance. The views are mine and no one else's. And I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. My absence is sponsored by Southwest Airlines. So economists have a fairly settled view of rent control, right? Lindbeck said 50 years ago, it's the most efficient way to destroy a city short of bombing. Paul Krugman said it's among the least controversial issues in the field. And there's a lot of real empirical work behind that on housing supply, on misallocation of housing units. I'm not here to contest any of that today. But I am here to say that overwhelmingly that research is really about supply and prices. It says almost nothing about the people and how they're affected by rent regulation policies. And so we have essentially no causal evidence on what policies like this do to families and children. A recent review of the empirical literature on rent control, quite comprehensive, cataloged more than 100 papers studying 26 distinct outcomes, but not one of them concerned children or intergenerational mobility. And this is a first order question for sort of any public policy that operates on families, and it just hasn't really been studied, in part because it requires linking data on policy implementation to individual outcomes over a really long period of time, which, of course, perhaps most of the papers at this conference are doing. So this paper is providing the first causal evidence on this question of how rent regulation affects the long run outcomes of children exposed to it. So the setting I'm studying here is World War II era federal rent control. During the war, shortly after the start of the war in 1942, the Congress creates the Office of Price Administration and gives them the authority to freeze rents across most of the country. And at its peak in 1947, it lasted until 1953 in most places. And its peak in 1947, it covered 85% of US municipalities and 133 million people, and one of the largest housing market interventions in American history. And crucially, it was rolled out and withdrawn at different times in different places. So that staggered timing is going to be important. And the map here shows the duration of control of rent control by county in years. And so you can see it's concentrated in the industrial Northeast, Midwest, Pacific Coast, where you would guess where a lot of defense production activity happened. But you see there's also a lot of variation across basically every region. So why do we need to study this program? I alluded to it before. First of all, it's the fact that it was a wartime program is useful because it means that the timing and the implementation of the program was set by federal administrators reacting to defense and manufacturing driven housing conditions, um, not by local political coalitions or political conditions that usually sort of produce local rent control in more recent decades. So treatment assignment is more observable and more tractable empirically. Second, it started and ended, and we have sort of we can observe that whole process, which gives us untreated cohorts on both sides of the treatment window. And it just happened a really long time ago. So we can observe the entire adult working lives of people who were children at the time. Um, so okay, the data, which is sort of the heart of the real work of the project was the data collection. So there's no existing data set on this policy really. So I digitized the original regulatory orders from the Federal Register. Um, these regulations, they're just published in these, big daily collections of regulations. There are tables and there are open-ended prose. There's lots of things. But it does tell you for every municipality, the county, something called the defense rental area, which was sort of the administrative unit they used, and the start and end date, all in sort of running text. So here is an example from the Minneapolis defense rental area. It's sort of small here, but you can see on the top that in Anoka, Dakota, Hennepin, Ramsey, and Washington counties, rent control went into effect on November 1st, 1942. And then in these bottom two images, you can see the decontrol orders for two specific municipalities that I was able to pull quickly in this case from the area, in this case, Stillwater and White Bear Lake. So I went through all the regulations that pertain to this policy and extracted them by hand and kind of and put them into a structured database so we have one row pure municipality, so you can kind of get a sense of what that means: place, county, DRA, and the start and end dates. So the second half of the kind of construction is linking it to the administrative data. So the individuals are linked to the policy data because the policy was rolled up by municipality, I link them by residential location. And then use the picks that we heard a lot about during the keynote to link individuals across three individual level sources, spanning the life course. So data on childhood, these are covariates from the 1940 census. The main outcome is going to be adult income measured in tax data between 1969 and 1994. And I just do an average across all of the years of observation to get a kind of measure of lifetime earnings. And then some secondary outcomes, I'm going to look at educational attainment, home ownership, neighborhood quality index coming from the 2000 decennial. So ultimately, I'm going to get adult outcomes for more than 120 million people who are linked to the municipality and to their exposure to rent control. So exposure is going to be measured as a dose here, the number of childhood years, birth to age 18 that overlap a municipality's control window. So if you're born after a policy starts, or you turn 18 during the policy, your sort of exposure is truncated. If you're 18 before the policy starts, or you're born after the policy ends, you have zero exposure, and otherwise you have the full duration that the policy lasted in your municipality. And that importantly means that like I said before, you have untreated cohorts on both sides. Untreated in different ways, but untreated. Okay, so the research I use a cohort diff and diff. I'll keep this brief since I think it's very familiar to the people in the room. You just think of a regular diff and diff, but replace calendar time with cohorts as the time axis, and we're comparing across municipalities. Um, Happy to talk more about, identification, estimation, but the basic important thing to know is that I'm going to use a kind of counterfactual imputation estimator where that's trained on the untreated data, only unexposed cohorts, to model untreated counterfactual outcomes and impute those for treated units and use that to estimate causal effects. So this is kind of following papers like Carroll Borisiak and others to deal with problems of heterogeneous effects and negative weighting, et cetera. The main thing to be concerned about is that rent control was implemented earlier in places that had a lot of investment in defense, and so they had booming labor markets. And recent research by Andrew Guerin in this particular historical context has shown that that investment itself had an effect on long run income. So maybe we'll just pick that same effect up and nothing to do with rent control. So I gathered the data. I got the data on the defense investment, and so we'll condition on that. Um, and also again the fact that we can do two tests before the policy and after is going to be important in helping corroborate the design. So okay, so here's the main result is going to be an event study for the onset of rent control. Now, the x-axis is age at policy onset, so cohorts born earlier are further to the right. So you should sort of read it right to left. And this is going to show you the effect of any non-zero exposure to rent control. And what you see is that cohorts who were already adults when the policy began show no effect, but some small effects on people who were already young adults when the policy started. But as age at first exposure falls, childhood dose rises and the effects climb, plateauing to about $13,000 in adult household income. That's in 2025 dollars for cohorts exposed to the full duration of the policy. And then on the far left, you see that cohorts that are born after the policy begins show some effect, but kind of proportionate to the duration of their exposure, their effect falls. I don't have really time to get into the details, but if I do an event study for the policy termination, we get a similar pattern and a similar effect magnitude. In the interest of okay, I'll talk about this briefly. So that was a kind of binary. You get the effect of any rent control versus none. But if you fit a dose response model that allows us to estimate per year effects, we get a similar result measured in, now the x-axis is years of exposure, and it's roughly linear and says about per year effect of $1,200 in 2025 dollars. And this is robust to conditioning on all the things that I mentioned, both at the municipality level and at the individual level, coming from the 1940 census data. Okay, so I mentioned secondary outcomes. So sort of in terms of mechanisms, how did this effect work? I'm just seeing the chat, sorry. The clearest channel is about education. There's no effect on high school completion. This is basically a null effect, but individuals exposed to rent control were meaningfully more likely to complete a 4-year degree, about 2 percentage points at the longest exposure. And I think that sort of makes sense if what's going on is that rent control is giving households more money to spend on other things, so you don't really have to spend for high school, but you spend money for college and forego young adult earnings. So I think this result sort of makes sense if what's going on is a sort of budget relief mechanism. Briefly, because I'm running out of time, I'll just add here that a second potential channel, which I think still need to think more about exactly what's going on here. You might expect rent control to keep families kind of rooted in place. That's certainly what both the theoretical and empirical literature on rent control has said that it reduces residential mobility. And it did sort of by definition prevent displacement evictions in the short run, but its lasting effect was the opposite. Exposed children were far more likely to leave their childhood county as adults, about 2.5 percentage points for a 5-year exposure. So, you know, again, I don't know exactly what the story is, but it doesn't seem to be a story of long-term residential stability, but maybe some kind of expanded choice set. One way or another, it seems like by relaxing household budgets and freeing up income to spend on things besides rent, kids were able to go to college and move out of places where they grew up and increasing their opportunities. The story here is that there's not much of a story for neighborhood quality and homeownership. Last thing I want to say is share this effect heterogeneity by race, which are deeply unequal. Per year of exposure, white children gained about $1,000, Black children about 250. That's a quarter as much. And the policy was, nominally, formally race neutral. But, how well it was enforced, the ability of tenants to get their complaints heard by a largely white federal bureaucracy meant probably that enforcement was really unequal across neighborhoods, across segregated neighborhoods. And so I think this is kind of a story about not so much heterogeneous effects as different versions of the policy, that I think it's very likely that Black households did not really actually totally benefit, did not experience rent control with the same intensity in the first place. So I'll just wrap up there. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing what people think.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Luca. I work in Germany. I'm an economist in Munich, but I did grad school here in the US, and that's where I started working on this whole research agenda about New Deal era policies with a spatial component and how they shaped urban inequality. And this paper is part of this agenda, and it's joint work with Hector, who's based in Rutgers, New Jersey. So public housing is not a popular public intervention in America today. And when it's discussed in the public debate, it's often associated with urban decay and African-American segregation. And the images that often comes in mind are the ones of towers in the park in Chicago or similar public housing projects. So the federal government spent a lot of money building these public housing projects during the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and then it spent also a lot of money tearing them down starting in the 90s and in the early 2000s. But I want to go back in time when public housing in America felt different. So if we go back to the 1930s, we find a unique program where Washington took charge of public housing. It's the only time where the federal government directly built and managed public housing in America, because right after this program, everything was decentralized. They would just send money to local housing authorities, and then each city would have its own history in terms of public housing. These buildings were not the towers in the park that people often associate with public housing in America, but they were mostly low and medium density housing structure with good design standards and good materials, good building standards. This is all to say that these projects were not the nightmarish tower people often think about, but they were nice places where people actually wanted to move in. Another thing to keep in mind that makes this type of public housing projects very different from the typical US public housing image is that this was not welfare of last resort. This was not targeted to the poorest Americans. The target was low-income Americans that could still afford to pay some type of rents. So we're talking about like the third income quartile, the third lowest income quartile. So low-income Americans, but still people that were working and they could pay a little rent. It's still shocking to say this, but it's probably not surprising that all these buildings were, of course, well, not all of them, sorry, the vast majority of them were completely segregated in terms of race. So these buildings were either blacks only or whites only. In this project, we try to estimate the consequences of this federal intervention, both on the neighborhoods where these public housing projects were placed and also on the people that lived in those areas. In what I show today, I will mostly focus on how we built the data set, which was necessary for this project, and I'll give you a snapshot, a kernel of a couple of the first results we have. We're working on a lot more, but my idea is just to give you an idea of the infrastructure we built, and then I would really like to hear from you what else you would like to see, what kind of outcomes you would like to see in a project like that. So how are we going to estimate this project? We're really focusing on a specific public housing project in America developed by the PWA, the Public Works Authority, the housing division of the PWA, and so we're going to focus only on 47 projects that were built. Tomorrow you will hear about another paper by Bo that focuses on a much longer time span and much more housing projects throughout the second half of the 20th century. Here, we're basically focusing only on the grandparent of all those public housing projects, the first and unique federal intervention that came before anything else. We're gonna to measure the consequences of building these projects. We're gonna build a data set where we're gonna have our treated projects, this project that were built, and we're gonna compare them with 84 projects that were planned by the PWA, but that were never completed. I'm gonna give you a little bit of the idea about the research design, but the basic intuition is that we're gonna compare areas that are close to the project versus areas that are farther away from these projects, and we're gonna do this thing both in treated sites and control sites. Just as a little preview, we find the mechanical effects that we are supposed to find. Black-only public housing projects increase Black concentration at their sites. We find evidence that white-only projects did create some displacement of Black incumbent residents. When we try to zoom out a bit and look for more effects that are not mechanical, but like the start of a sorting cascade or some sort of white flight, so market responses ignited by this public intervention, we do not find much. So at the state of the project, we would characterize our results as institutional and contained. We find the mechanical the mechanical effect of this intervention, but we do not find large spatial spillover. We find the effects mostly at the footprints. Okay, so this was the overview of the paper. Now I'm gonna give you a couple more details about the background. So we are at a unique time in American history, and in particular, a unique time in American political history. We are after the crisis of 1929 and the ensuing housing crisis. It was a unique political time in which the Secretary of Interior, which was also the chief of the PWA, could say things like that it was obvious that our much vaunted private initiative is unable or unwilling to undertake the job of providing housing for the lowest income Americans. And on the basis of this unique political movement, the federal government was able to get approval from Congress for directly build and manage public housing. This starts a very complicated history of how this agency managed this approval. To make things easy, I'm just going to try to summarize the complicated development of this program with the fact that they started assembling this project at the beginning of 1935. We're talking about January and February 1935. They started exchanging letters, telegrams with local committees all around the countries. A first drawback, a first exogenous shock came in July when a judge ruled that the housing division could not use eminent domain to acquire the land to build this public housing. And the second final shock came in September when the President Roosevelt, wanted to move on quickly with this intervention. And there was, of course, a budget cut because there's never enough money as you would like. And so they just proceeded with only the projects that they could fund and they could be sure to build with minimum delay. We are trying to use these two variations to argue that these projects that were planned but never built are a good control group, and we can use them as a comparison group for the project that were actually built by the agency. So very quickly, the data for completed projects were easy. We know where they are. We know lots of detail about them. What take years, more than 2 years, was try to figure out data about the control project. There is no list anywhere about control projects. Actually, the closest thing that goes close to a list at the National Archives, these are scans I took. This is the last report for the housing division of this federal agency. It's the only thing from the National Emergency Council that was completely crossed in red. That is red pencil. They printed this, and then in September they scraped everything with red pencil. So we had to find this information somewhere else. So we opened the boxes at the National Archives in College Park, and we found maps and we found archival text that described where they were planning these control projects that they scraped last minute. And with all this information, we built shapes for both the control projects in orange and the treated project in blue. We merged these shapes with IPUMS data that we geocoded the best way I can. It's a work that I started doing during my PhD. And we feed all this information when we need to construct area level variables on a grid of hexagons, and each hexagon is roughly the size of a block in a city like Chicago or New York. Okay, this is the distribution over the country of the projects. You see there isn't much in the West, but other than that, these projects are scattered pretty much around the country. And here, this is a table comparing averages before the intervention. So we're talking about 1930 in treated sites, the first column, and control sites, the last column. Here there isn't matching, there isn't weighting. It's just pure data building based on archival evidence. And we were relieved to see that the areas where they were planning these control projects, it's not so different from the areas where they built these projects. Very quickly, the research design, the workhorse in the public housing literature is to compare areas closer to a project versus area farther away. The idea is that, of course, the overall location of a project is endogenous, but given a certain area, the precise location is somewhat exogenous. And I'm sorry for all the non-economists in the room, but this is just because economists do obsess about exogeneity, so we need to figure out an empirical method to estimate the causal effect of this development. An alternative is to compare at a given distance, areas where they actually built a project with an area where they were planning, but they did not complete the project. So that would be the control group. We're going to combine these two ideas with a triple diff design where we compare area closer to the project versus farther away areas, both in treated and control areas. This is already getting a little bit too complicated for my taste, but we do it this way because the identifying assumption that you need to believe it's actually the weakest. So you just need to believe that the gradient near versus far in those two types of areas would have evolved in the same way in the absence of the intervention. Very, very quickly, the results. These are the mechanical effects that we do find. So this is just to motivate that we think that we built an infrastructure that actually tell us meaningful thing about this project. On the left, you have the black share. On the right hand, you have the white share. Blue is for black projects, gray is for white project. Black project increased the concentration of black Americans, and white project diminished that. The picture is the opposite for white project. If we zoom out a little bit, we pool black and white project, we don't find much. So the first message here is that it doesn't make sense to look at this program as a unique program, but it's best understood as two separate programs. And the other points that you see in the graphs there, it's zooming out. So going farther away from the footprint, we do not find much. Last thing that I want to show you with MLP linking incumbents in 1930 with later decades with MLP. We find 70% in 1940, 45% in 1950. We can see if white and blacks American differentially moved out from certain areas given the racial designation of the public housing. If you would see any white flight, you would see that in the top left corner. So you would see white residents moving out differentially in the first row, and we do not see that. Yep. So I'm done with my time. This is the conclusion. The one message that I would like to convey as a conclusion is that it's work in progress. I would really like to hear from you what else you would like to see in this project. For this set of results that we have so far, I think we can say that there was a time in which there was a different type of public housing in America, where public housing is not synonym with racial segregation. We do find increased concentration of African Americans, but that's what I'd say it's not due to public housing per se, it's due to the racial designation of public housing and all the other negative externalities often associated with public housing. We do not find them for this specific program from the 1930s. Thanks a lot, and apologies, I took a couple of minutes more.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you all for sticking around this late into the afternoon. This is a very long-running project with that Christian Dippel and I have been working on for quite some time as we assemble lots and bits and pieces of this. So I'm going to present some of that today, thinking about this policy focused on land allotment and really a land privatization effort on American Indian reservations. So when we kind of think about, we'd like to maybe think about government policy, right? We think a lot of it is, can fluidly adjust to kind of economic conditions. But there's a set of policies, right, that we worry about creating kind of durable institutions. And when those are kind of poorly designed, they can really constrain long-run adaptation, right? So there's some initial purpose, the economy evolves in some way, and there's something persistent about this policy that can lock you into kind of a problematic state. And we think this is exactly what happens in the late 19th century, where US federal Indian policy was really focused on cultural assimilation, right? It was focused on, transforming Native society through, church attendance, land ownership, farming. There was this sort of ideal of the Judeo-Christian work ethic and this sort of Jeffersonian yeoman farmer, okay? And so through this policy, the government introduces the Dawes Act, which is this system of property rights. And it has a bunch of ingredients that we're going to talk about, but it creates this sort of institutional lock-in that then made it very difficult for reservations and reservation communities to kind of move as the economy moves. Okay. So that's really kind of setting the table for this research agenda and what we're going to look at. Okay. So just for today, we're going to focus on just maybe the first part of this project, where we look at kind of this initial exposure to this policy. It comes in kind of two phases, right? There's the initial allotment of lands, which are held in trust, and we're going to look at kind of how that affects individuals. And then there's a secondary arm to this trust land where the individual trustees can receive a fee simple, kind of a private ownership title, and we can look at that same set of outcomes as sort of what happens with fee simple. This is all going to be in kind of the intent to treat in a repeated cross-section design. What 13 minutes doesn't give us time for is the linked data portion of this, where we've actually designed a linking algorithm that's kind of custom and unique for American Indians that we use to link land records. And I'll drop some breadcrumbs for that as we go. So as we think about these kind of phases of federal policy, there's a long list, and there's a lot of different phases in terms of how the federal government has treated American Indians and policies around sort of, land, sort of assimilation, tribal governments. And we're going to focus on kind of these two, right? This window of what is known as kind of the assimilation era and then this brief window of reorganization, where we start to get the formation of modern tribal governments. Okay? And so the motivations for allotment really were tied to this sort of fundamental belief that property ownership was really a central part of, kind of developing and sort of moving forward and integrating into American society. And so you can see that the author of the bill themselves, sort of Henry Dawes, has this quote about all of these different things that they really saw as part of this assimilation campaign. And when we look at kind of records from the Office of Indian Affairs, they were tracking these things. We see counts of the number of people wearing civilized dress and attending church, what types of homes that individuals are living in are actually still followed into the 1950s. There's a special schedule that we've digitized in the 1950s census, and for every household, we get to know characteristics about their homes, okay? So there's very clear sort of like goals in here, including this really fundamental belief about the virtue of private property ownership and farming. And so this is a picture that actually comes from a ceremony that they did at least once, okay, where when an individual, they would step forward from their teepee, they would shoot an arrow into the ground, they would reach out, they would put their hand on the plow, and it was meant to be this sort of like ceremonial transition. This was a big part of what kind of the federal government was implementing across the US. And so this policy rolls out in the 1880s, and the Office of Indian Affairs and really the executive branch gets to determine where and when, with the ultimate plan that every reservation was eventually going to be allotted. The policy kind of has there's sort of a couple adjustments, addendums, the Burke Act being one of those that really accelerates the process. Oklahoma gets its own sort of version of this, and there's a couple, even within Minnesota, there's one where there's like a slightly different version of this related policy. But what happens is in the Roosevelt administration, and following a government report known as the Merriam Report, they realized this policy is failing. And so there's a sort of abrupt end with the kind of executive branch change that comes around in 1932. And so we actually get kind of the abrupt end of this policy. And so there's kind of this implementation at the federal level, and then on the ground, the policy was really conceived, I think, in a similar way to the Homestead Act. It was allocating 160-acre allotments to households. There was sort of the bootlegger ingredients in the policy where the unallotted land was made available for external surplus sales, where that land was to be held in, or the revenues, the proceeds from that land would be held in trust, but it was sold at that kind of public rate. A feature of the policy is that allotments were held in trust, and there was a local resident agent that was in charge of determining when an individual would actually be granted title, and the term that was associated that the agent was in charge of deeming was whether or not that Native American individual was deemed competent. And with that, you would get kind of this, it would be released from the trust status, and they would have full fee simple title. Okay. The major constraint between the trust land and fee simple was transferability. And so we have another paper where we look at some of these limitations, but you can imagine a limitation around collateralizability. There's issues of heirship and transfer. This creates, particularly around agriculture, assembly problems where it's hard to kind of reallocate and find the optimal farm size. Okay, so this introduces a bunch of these kind of constraining institutional challenges. Okay. So how do we observe the allotment process? Well, because the land was still held, reservation land is held in the public domain, it actually lives with the Bureau of Land Management as part of kind of the overall public domain record. And so we actually see and have digitized and have gathered and kind of worked to assemble all of the land transactions. So we can actually see trust patents. We can basically see those being originated. We can see them then being, if they're converted to fee, we can observe that as well. And there's opportunities to observe the patentee name and allotment numbers, which we can use to link to other records. Okay, so from here, we're going to be able to generate kind of reservation by year totals and also observe individual patents. The PLSS locations allow us to map these then into space. And so we can know something about kind of where the patents are and pieces of the quality of those patents themselves. Okay. Kind of just to summarize, we can see really the policy, there's an initial uptake. A lot of the policy doesn't really get going until that Burke Act of 1906, because that actually makes this transferability and sales possible. And overall, like the punchline story of allotment is one of a big transfer of a big transfer of land out of native ownership overall. Okay, so we're going to bring in the 5 waves. That says 1950, but we haven't fully integrated that because we don't quite have the spatial detail we need quite yet, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But we're going to bring in all of these. We've done the work to kind of integrate, like I mentioned, the 1950 special schedule for this. But in order to really look at this at the reservation level, we need to be able to assign these individuals to reservations. And so part of that, we started this process, and then the Burkes and co-authors in the Census Place Project released some of their data. We actually finish that data. We use georeferencing from enumeration districts and some other resources, large language models, to actually fill out and assign locations to every individual, every Native American in all 5 waves, okay? So we actually know kind of where they live within a reservation, whether they're nearby, and those that are further away for 380 places. So we can actually start to map that. We can start to understand, I think there's a whole pile of kind of future questions and non-land allotment related questions about sort of demographic change, about the red dots are people, American Indian households that are away from reservation communities. These are kind of colors and heights for all the different changes. We can see how communities change, spread over time. I think there's a bundle of things here. The core of the design is really going to leverage kind of the fact that some reservations receive allotment while others don't. There's a bit of selection in there that we're going to lean on the literature to help kind of address. And then we're also going to look at this fee simple conversion as well, as kind of a share of allotted patents that are ever converted. So we're going to put both of these through kind of the modern difference to difference meat grinder. And just kind of, like I said, the only real unique feature in here is we optionally bring in some of these pre-treatment reservation covariates that were shown to be important in other work, okay? So the punchlines of what we find, kind of overall from the initial allotment, we basically find farming increases. That's not totally surprising. If anything, that's kind of a sanity check on the policy itself. That we know that the policy did what, or we're at least able to measure and quantify what the policy was intended to do, which is move people to farms. We see a little bit of home ownership and not much change in household size. I think what we find most interesting in this overall is the changes in labor market activity, where what we actually tend to find is this change comes at the expense of actually moving people out of, sort of higher occupational score jobs, right? So they're kind of actually like maybe moving down this kind of occupational ladder. We see a reduction in white collar employment. We do see some shift in people, right? There's not unemployment over the entire 5 decades, but we use occupation to kind of look at the no occupation group and see some small declines in the no occupation. We see people like taking occupations, but not the highest quality occupations, okay? Not big changes in education. When we move to the second arm, and we see people starting to be able to sell that land or not sell the land, to actually have the allotment converted to fee. Some of them sold, some of them did not. We actually see the farming decline, and we actually see the home ownership really decline. And so this thing that individuals were locked into, we start to see on the farming side, on the home ownership side, or the property value side, we see big declines there. But unfortunately, there's no change in that income selection. If anything, those differences that we saw before, the worsening income scores, slightly worse white collar employment actually seems to deepen. Okay, and so we think there's some evidence in what we're seeing, at least in this intent to treat work, of this kind of land policy that has sort of locked these communities into this kind of, into agriculture. It's sort of conceived in the 1880s, implemented then through the 1920s and 30s as ag declines, and has sort of locked communities into this negative state. So, I'm out of time, but thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Shiyan Wang from Colorado State University. This is very preliminary work with my advisor, Professor Alessandro Bonanno. So welcome to any comments and suggestions. So today I'm going to talk about the benefit cliffs in nutrition assistance program. So what happens when a state crosses a cliff, and how families cope with that and using their time and their money. So what's a benefit cliff? So when a family earns a little bit more, and they will pass the program threshold, and they will lose the whole bunch of benefit all at once. Their income goes up, but the net resources didn't. So, and the SNAP has one of the sharpest cliff. So the federal gross income test at 130% of the federal poverty line. For a family of three, it's about $2,300 per month in 2019. So when the family their income goes up, they will lose the benefit. And once they cross the line, they will lose the whole benefit. And a second problem is the recertification paperwork can push the families out temporarily, even their needs hasn't changed. So in this paper, states have been moving the cliff. It's called the broad-based categorical eligibility, or BBCE. So the states raised its gross income limit as much as 200% of the poverty line. So what happens to the household the cliff used to bind, and how they cope with using their time and their money? So in 2003, 9 states have the expanded program cliff. By 2019, 29 states did a change. You can see a big jump in 2009 and 2010. So we want to know, based on the state, they choose the changing timing, they change the cliff location. I mean, they can choose to up to 150% or 185%. So the changing timing, the cliff location, that's a variation I use. So in this talk, I want to answer the 3 questions. First one is food insecurity. When state moves its eligibility cliff outward, how does food insecurity change for the household near the old cliff? That means the income limit is between the 130% to 200% poverty of the federal line, relative to always eligible household. Always eligible household means their income is always below the 130% of the federal poverty line. Second one, who adjusts? Does the relative response differ across dual owner, single earner, or neither employee couples? Because they have the different household or working allocation. So I want to know whether there is a different response. Third, copy in the time and money. So on the data, does the food spending change? Does the household the food production time change? All this allocation between in this household change. Like if we get the SNAP, we can let one family member didn't go to work or lose the benefit while two couples go to work. So here's the data. I used IPUMS CPS food supplement survey for the left side from 2003-2019. It gives me food insecurity, SNAP receipt, food spending, income to poverty ratio. But the income to poverty ratio is I calculated from the survey. If I want to get the specific ratio, I think the PSID data have the calculated data. On the other side, I used IPUMS ATUS data from 2004-2019. It's a one-day diary for several activity time. So I just choose like 3 category capturing the food production time, because the data, the activity time use data is just one diary data. So I predict the weekly household time using data on the food production using on the specific one. So we can talk about later in the Q&A section. So I got the bridge between two data sets is the CPS IDP variable. So the family answers the food supplement survey in December in year T. I will match the same CPS IDP variable in the next T+1 year to get the couples that also have the food insecurity variable and the time use data. So I got around 59,000 couples for the partners from 18 to 59 and income below 100%. And I also got the 1,600 couples by linking the two data sets. So the measurement, the cliff exposure comes from the income different. So I set 2 categories like the near eligible from 130 to 200% federal profit line. This means when the states moves a cliff, they have chance to get the benefit. And the second group is always eligible. It means no matter the state change its program limit or not, they always can accept the benefit. So outcome is the food insecurity variable. It's 12 months self-report variable from the FSS data. So it's a household food insecurity. It's a 12-month scale. Like you should answer 18 questions to including whether you have enough food, or did you worry about renting or get some enough money to pay your food production. Food production. So I categorize this. There is a 1 or 0 variable for the food insecurity. So there are 3 variables are the coping variables, like the money. I use the weekly food spending per capita, and time T means weekly household food production time. Like I mentioned before, it's predict household food production time for responser, because the time use data is for 1 person per household. So I predicted not showing couples to get a predict time use data for this couple. And okay, sorry, excuse me. So first, because the time use data is just for response person in this day, so we didn't know the other 6 days number. We predicted the other 6 days and to get a total weekly number for the responser. And we get some characteristics for the both couples and to predict the other one, the didn't respond for the time using data to get these two numbers to get the household food production time data. And the division D, like I said, I got the couples food production time, and I calculate the division D means within couple task consideration. If it more than to 1, and it means they have more concentration of the for the production time, like only one family member do all the housework and all the food production work. And I also consider couples heterogeneity for the single owner, dual owner, and neither employed. And in another chapter of my dissertation, I checked the intermarriage and the nativity difference in food production and food insecurity. So I add the intermarriage and the nativity variable in this work, because for the intermarriage and nativity household, they have more extra coordination or the information fractions. So I want to know the 3 differences. First income, near eligible couples, which is between 130 to 200 federal poverty line bound by federal cliff versus couples below 130% federal poverty line. And difference 2, policy states that raise the gross income limit versus states that did not. And difference is 3, the couple type. So I want to estimate how the near and below 130 food insecurity gap responds when the cliff moves, and whether that response differs by couple type. Each comparison is made within the same state and year. So let's convert to the equation mode. So the BBCEST means gross limit, so it changes from 1.3 to 2, so full expansion is 0.0 unit. So the K means single or neither. So our base group is dual earner household. So the single or the neither earned household will be the comparison group. And now the result 1. So we can see the very top one, 8.5% change, which means when a state moves a cliff near eligible, dual owner couples will increase their food insecurity. That's strange, right? For the dual owners, when the state expand the limit, like you can get more from the SNAP, but your food insecurity level it was going up. So I will explain in next page. So for the single owner is minus 5.4. Sorry. So I will tell you why the baseline group is different. So the DDD compares near eligible household to always eligible household in the state year. But for dual owners couples, they have little space to coordinate by accepting the benefit or not. But for the single earner household, they can choose two member go to work, or they have more space to adjust to accepting the benefit. And lessons for the cliff elevation, moving cliff can change behavior on both sides of the cliff, not with the new eligible groups. So I did 3 identification checks, and like I said, the results showed spending and total food production time show little response. But for the task consideration is a little bit suggestive. I got the suggestive result. And intermarriage and nativity, I didn't see any systematic heterogeneity. But in my another chapter, I did see the different patterns in intermarried and nativity couples. And this 4 takeaways. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much, the organizer, to include this paper. So my name is Gabriel Cruz. I am a PhD student at the University of Maryland. And today I'm going to present this ongoing project titled My Mother Was a Suffragist, the Intergenerational Effects of Women's Right to Vote, and it's joined with Fernanda Rojas, she's a professor in Wisconsin-Madison. So let me start, let me play to the time. So let me start by saying that we know the right to vote was extended to American women in 1920 after decades of activism. So the literature says that women enfranchisement has positive impact at the aggregated level. So we know that it's going to increase the public investment, and also it's going to improve outcomes in the next generation. However, we know little about what are the individual consequences after the 19th Amendment. So what happened to the women that decided to register related to the labor market and also family outcomes? And even less we know about what are the impact on the next generation at the individual level. So what happened with the kids of these women that decided to register, okay? However, we know that it's complicated to have a causal interpretation because the decision to be part of this political movement is not random, okay? So we are going to use a setting and some empirical identification strategies to try to have a more causal interpretation of this type of questions, okay? So let me explain what we are trying to answer. So the question that we want to answer is what are the effects of women enfranchisement on their own outcomes and those for their kids? So the setting that we're going to use is going to be Boston. So we are going to say that it's going to be an ideal case for the following reasons. So Massachusetts had no prior women's voting rights in state or federal elections before the 19th Amendment. So this was a state that we could see a lot of movement to try to get the right to vote for women. And also it's because we know that Boston and Massachusetts has amazing type of data. So basically we can identify who were these women that registered after the 19th Amendment, okay? So in the end, we are going to take this whole population of Boston that we can identify, and we're going to link to the census of 1920. So we're going to observe all the eligible women, and we're going to know what women decided to register and what women decided not to register, okay? And we're going to have a linkage rate of 75%, that is pretty high for this literature. And then we are going to use 2 identification strategies. So first, we are going to use an inverse probability score, difference in difference design to see the impact of women's outcomes related to labor market outcomes and family outcomes in the long term. And also we are going to use within this household design to see the long-term effect of the kids of the women that decided to register. And why we are going to use a within household design? Because we know that it's not random. So it's going to be a selection of these women. So we are going to compare siblings with this idea that you, for example, you were 17 years old, you were more exposed in comparison to your sister that were 3 years old during this period, okay? So let me explain quickly the results that we have. So we're going to see first, there is going to be selection. So the women that registered, they are going to be more educated, they are going to be more younger, they are going to be more in the labor force, they are going to come from richer families, and also they are going to be more likely to be married. Okay, so basically we know there is going to be a selection in these women. So for that reason, we are going to calculate a propensity score, and we're going to use this propensity score with all the observables that we have, and we are going to use this propensity score to reweight our observation to account for this selection, and we are going to run this difference in different design to see long-term effects in these women, and we're going to see that in the long term, these women that registered, they're going to be more in the labor force, and they're going to have less babies in the long term. And these effects are going to be driven just for single women. Okay, so we don't see any happening related to the married women that decided to register. However, we want to see if something happened in the kids of these women. And actually, we're going to see that the kids of these women are going to be, the daughters of these women are going to, they are going to be more in the labor force, they are going to have higher wages, and there's nothing happening related to the sons. So here we are thinking like a conceptual framework that could be a gender norms transmission, because you saw your mother fighting to have this right to vote. So just to be clear, we are thinking this decision to register as a proxy of women empowerment, okay? So let me show you quickly the data that we are using. So here, this work is in collaboration with the Maria Liza project. This is an amazing group of historians, women in Boston, that basically they took these books. So we are going to have 50,000 women, and they're going to digitize this data, and we're going to take this data, and we're to link the data to the census of 1920. Okay, and we are going to follow them across time from 1910 to 1950, and we're going to see their husbands and also their kids. So the linkage rate, no, the 28% of the women of Boston decided to register, okay? So we love maps, so for that reason I wanted to show this. So basically here in panel A, you're observing the maps of Boston divided by wards, and here in panel B, you're seeing the Boston divided by districts, and you can see that we are going to have variations related to the probability to register within wards and across wards. Okay, so we can observe all these women in Boston in the census, and we can see their kids of these women. So let me show you the results and what we are doing related to the women's own outcomes. So we are going to implement this inverse propensity score, difference in difference design. So here the challenge is the selection. So we know that registered women differ on observables and observables related to the women that decided not register. So for that reason, we are going to calculate this propensity score, and we are going to reweight our observation to account for this selection, and then we are going to run a difference in difference approach design. So I'm going to run this event study. I'm not going to give you details, but we are going to have word fixed effects. We are going to use baseline characteristics. We're going to control for that. And so let me show you the plots of this. So here in panel A, we're seeing the employment outcomes. So you can see that after the 19th Amendment, the registered women in comparison to the unregistered women, they're going to have higher probability to be in the labor force. They're going to be employed. And here in panel B, we are seeing the married outcome, so it's going to be a decrease in the probability to be married, okay? When we run this estimation by marital status, so we are going to run the same specification, but we are going to split the sample for single women and married women, and you're going to see the positive impact is driven by single women. So nothing is happening related to the married women, okay? So what I want to highlight of this slide is that. So nothing is happening related to married women in comparison with the registered women that is, so nothing is happening among married women, okay? So, however, the motivation of this is that, okay, we are not observing nothing in them. However, we want to see that something is happening in the kids of these women. So, as I told you, married women employment doesn't change, but registration may matter through intergenerational channels. So kids could see their mother fighting or going to register. So it could be a transmission of attitudes, for example. So for that reason, if we compare kids of unregistered and registered women, that difference could be biased for selection. So for that reason, we are going to run this within design. This within household design. So we are going to compare siblings at different ages in 1920, the same family, with the idea if you were older, you were more exposed to this political empowerment, okay? So basically, using these household fixed effects, we are going to observe all mother-level characteristics, including the decision to register, and here the assumption of identification is going to be that mother registration doesn't correlate with relative ages of her kids. Okay, so the prediction here that we have is like, if political mobilization matters, older daughters should respond more. So let me show you an example of this estimation. So here I'm taking the long-term effects, so the wages of sisters, of daughters in the years of 1940 and 1950, and we are going to estimate this regression for a registered household and non-registered household. So just to have an idea of the interpretation of this estimation is like, if you see this dot, that means like if you were 12 years old, you are going to have higher wages in comparison to the youngest if you were 0 years old in the 19th Amendment, okay? And we are going to run this for the unregistered household and registered households. So the difference between the dots, we are going to call in this like the transmission of this political empowerment on different outcomes in the long terms. So you can see here, the plot is that difference. So you can see that we observe a positive impact among adolescents and nothing happening in the less exposed daughters during this period. So here we are thinking like this could be a story about the level of exposure and how you see your mother fighting. And the second slide that I want to show you related to this is like using the same outcome. So here observing wages, we observe nothing is happening related to the boys. So this is like a gender norm story that the daughters could see their mother fighting. So that is going to be a transmission of that, and nothing is happening related to the boys because there is a gender role story. Okay, so we are working, trying to understand and trying to have a better interpretation of all of this. But let me show you the last slide. So basically in the last slide, I want to show you that we are going to calculate the slopes for different outcomes for the sisters and for the boys and girls. So we're going to have labor outcomes, family outcomes, and educational outcomes. So you can see that we're calculated in the slope, so we can see that panel A is the sisters, so we're going to see positive impact related to the probability to be in a public work and also related to wages. Nothing is happening related to family outcomes, and we are observing that something is happening related to educational outcomes. So the interpretation of this is like increasing 1 year of exposed to this period, increase your, for example, your wage in $10. And you can see in panel B, we observe nothing related to brothers or sons. So you can see that everything is like super close to zero, okay? So that is a story about gender norms and also the level of exposure during this period. So we're working on this and we're collecting more data, of course. So let me finish. So I want to say that we are here showing that historical data from Boston to study the effects of women enfranchisement. We can see that it's going to be a positive effect on employment for the next 30 years, and it's going to be driven by single women. Nothing is happening among married women, but we see a positive impact on their daughters. So we can see that we are now working on a conceptual framework to try to have a better interpretation of these results. So thank you so much.